Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome back Mr Glastonbury himself, Paul Weston. Paul was on the show late last year, talking us through the high strange journey of how his latest book came about. Said book is now out in the world, so we pick the story back up and run it to its conclusion? Mr Weston, welcome back.
Great to be here as always, Gordon.
So you were on not that long ago talking about the process of writing your latest book, and it's now out, and I've read it, and so I think, and it's great, by the way. But there's certainly more to tell in the story of its manifestation and ultimately its content. So thank you for coming back on the show.
My pleasure.
All right, so before we hit the record button, Paul, you were mentioning there is more to the tale of the birth of the book. So maybe we pick it up right there. How was its birth?
Right. Well, I spoke before about the process of the creation of the cover, and that all helped fuel the sense that, although I was writing about events that was decades in the past, that the contents were psychoactive and they weren't just for me and my jollies. And this process continued to an absolute Terence McKenna 2012 Mandelbrot fractal reality apocalypse, really, during the final weeks of getting the thing together. Tremendous processes were occurring. A good example for starters, there is a chapter in there called Rainbow in the Void, which is really about a week in January 1993 when I engaged in some fairly serious Tibetan input and read a number of books in a few weeks, and a lot of things was happening for me. And I knew it was virtually the last thing I was going to write, and I was even prepared with my deadlines to leave it out, but I really wanted to get something in there. I started rereading some of this material from books I read 25 years ago, and while this was going on, I'm also a Glastonbury tour guide, don't expect an awful lot of action in January, but in fact I did go round with a few people and got talking to this lady, and it turned out she was a Tibetan Buddhist, and she'd got quite a decent story to tell. She'd been out in Nepal, I think it was, some considerable time back. I think it was in the 90s. There was quite a famous guy called Lama Konchog, and he was one of these chaps who has just entered into a state of meditation, and to all intents and purposes he's dead. He just hasn't moved and done bugger all in years. And while she was out there, she said being in the presence of this virtual living corpse was like wading through jelly. The amount of energy present was quite phenomenal. And while she was there, he was actually pronounced dead, and they had one of these classic Tibetan funeral scenarios where they cremate the guy, and then you mysteriously find that there's a couple of footprints in his ashes pointing down to the local village where he's supposedly going to be reincarnated. There's an old documentary was made about this guy and the search for his reincarnation. But anyway, she's out there and ends up being given some of his ashes, which is quite a thing. And while we're going around Glastonbury, she suddenly gets the inspiration that she should send me some of these ashes with this, shawl Tibetan thing that's been blessed by the lamas and all the rest of it. So there I am thinking I've got to get this Tibetan stuff in and being quite happy with the gallop I'm going through. And in the process of that, I'm ending up with some ashes of this Baby Tibetan Lama actually going to be sent to me in the post, which is pretty damn surreal. So that encouraged me that there was a lot of voltage going on. And in the last week, the last thing I wrote inevitably was the introduction. Now, I will say there is a little James Joycean episode in the book, in the section Night Town and the Three Men, which involves me visiting a brothel. I'm not going to say anything more than that. I'm throwing that in as a little teaser, but I was very conscious of James Joyce, and I was glad that I'd given him a nod, because he was a tremendous influence on me. I don't think I would ever have been able to respond to John Cooper Powys in the way I have done if it wasn't for a foundation in James Joyce. And in the weekend that I was writing the introduction, and this was literally going to be something that, I had 3 or 4 days to do it in before I didn't giving the whole thing to my graphics man. I was talking to somebody, and it was a strange chain of associations, because I was talking to them about their son, who's about 20 or 21, and what he's reading. And I remembered an anthology called Drugs and Magic that I'd read way back in 1979, compiled by a guy called George Andrews, and I had fond memories of it. Now, at that time, there was a documentary on James Joyce by Angelica Houston that was screening on BBC and was on their iPlayer service. She had been in the movie of the short story The Dead, and I watched this thing the same night. And I remembered, back in 1979, right at the start of 1979, I'd gone through this sequence where I'd read everything by James Joyce in the order that he wrote it in. I think I failed with Finnegan's Wake. I got about 100 pages into it, and I just couldn't go any further. But I read the whole lot, and it was the last time I read The Dead. And I didn't have a copy of it anymore. I found a PDF of it online, and I read the story again. And there's this famous conclusion where this woman is nostalgically thinking about this person that who had been in love with her decades before and had now died, and the snow starts falling, and she thinks of the snow falling all over Ireland, and particularly falling on the graveyard where this person's buried. And I suddenly sort of clicked in all of these associations. So back in 2012, when my mother had died, which was near to this time of year, and after the funeral, took a whole bunch of old photos back to Glastonbury, and on the way back to Glastonbury from Essex, it started snowing. And when I got back to Glastonbury and started looking at all of these old photos, I actually, was very conscious and thought of the snow falling on the now empty family home back in Essex, and feeling very strange and emotional about it. And I hadn't made that association with Joyce's story, but it was very strong. And then I started thinking about the fact that, first of all, my father's funeral was February the 1st, 2002. My mother's funeral was February the 3rd, 2012. But they were the same Friday in February, essentially 10 years apart, which was quite symmetrical. And then I kind of clocked that Joyce's birthday was the 2nd of February, right in between them. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. And, you've read the book, the very last section of it, which opens up, I feel, the entire contents in a certain emotional way, concerns my father's time out in India and Burma in the war, and strange links with the Indian guru Meher Baba, mysterious episode where my father is taken to see some holy man in a cave that he'd never told me about before. I'm not going to go into that story, but the book basically concludes with a consideration of the mysterious destinies of me and my father. All this was in the airwaves. I give it to my graphics man, and it's out of my hands, and he's doing a bit of work, and then he says, I think we can get this to the printers this Friday. Do you want to do that? I said, fine. And it was only after I said that I realised that the book was going to go to the printers on the anniversary of my father's death. So there was just, as a result of this, all this kind of stuff, I managed to just change a couple of sentences in the introduction to reflect my roots in James Joyce, if you like, because I as you know, I'm obsessive about writing down when I read books and when I've seen movies, but this got off to a gradual start. I only made it a regular habit in 1981, but I did remember that I'd kind of started this a little bit in 1979, and that I'd recorded when I'd read these Joyce books And I thought, well, it's round about this time of year. Let's have a look. And it was quite startling because it turned out that I had read the Drugs and Magic anthology at the start of the week that I was talking about it to somebody this year. And then I'd gone into the Joyce section, and basically the last time I read The Dead was the day before the day that I saw Angelica Houston's documentary this time round. So all of this is reflected in the fact that I've said a little bit about Joyce and his epiphanies, his transformation of everyday life and the little events of everyday life, the revelation of the sacred and the mysterious that you can find in that, which was actually a tremendous influence on me that I'd practically forgotten. I wove that into the introduction and made a point that Joyce was going to get a name check on the back of the cover. So that was all, that was exhilarating. That obviously made me feel that it was almost absurd just how much emotional and synchronistic voltage was going into this thing. But then, of course, it's launch time. It manifests, and I've actually achieved my aim, which I probably spoke about in the previous conversation, that because there was a Glastonbury occult conference on a particular weekend, that it fell on the 25th anniversary of the weekend of the climax of the narrative in 1993, and I thought, well, this is irresistible. I've got to try and get this to land that way. It will be so powerful, and it did. It did. So what is then going to happen? The conference starts on a Saturday. There's a pre-launch social in the function room of a place in Glastonbury in the High Street. That's where I launched it, as I likewise launched Glastonbury Psychogeography 2 years ago. So first of all, it's fantastic because there's going to be two people around, Caroline Wise and Mick Staley, who had a tremendous influence on the contents of the book. Mick having been Kenneth Grant's closest associate for decades, Caroline and Mick, ultimately having published Kenneth Grant's later works, and Caroline, a psychic questing and Fellowship of Isis veteran. I had a lot of conversations with her about questing with the Egyptian Queen Sobek Nofru Ray. It was great. They were going to be there. So first of all, there we all are, and I won't go too much into the details, but cover artist Jerry Leach was there. He had some significant personal news that he shared with a few of us that was really great. But I'd invited my graphics man along, and he didn't show. And I thought, well, what's going on here then? And then the next day I never heard from him. I never even got an email saying, sorry, I couldn't turn up. Turned out that he was getting ready to come and blacked out, and was basically on his way to hospital in an ambulance at the point that I was launching the book. So I thought, oh my God, what have we got going on here? This is all very powerful stuff. We go into the conference itself, and Seth's assembled a really powerful grouping of people. There's a strong chaos magic contingent. There's going to be an OTO Gnostic Mass. There's a strong Wicca contingent as well. And obviously Caroline and Mick are there representing the Typhonian side of things and the Fellowship of Isis. So I thought, to what extent is anything in this conference going to kind of resonate with what I've got in the book? Now, I often talk about something that I call the waking dream, which is when stuff around you externalizes the internal processes in such a way that it's like if you actually dreamt it, you would be able to get a handle on it. You'd wake up and you'd interpret it in a certain way, and you'd recognize it doesn't follow the rules of the 3D consensus. But when it actually happens when you're awake, it can throw a bit of a wobber on you. But I'm kind of used to this now. First thing I noticed was the first person to speak was Janet Farrar. Now, way back when Stuart Farrer was still around, the two of them had presented this seashore ritual. They had cobbled together from the fragments in Dion Fortune's Sea Priestess novel a workable form of ritual by the seashore involving the fire of Azrael and so on. A major part of my narrative. There's a whole account, which I won't go into because I've told the story before, about how a number of us did this ritual in 1990, the immense effects it had, and it all comes back round again at Greendown in certain ways in the climax of the book. I didn't speak to Janet. There were people, a lot of people really wanted to talk to her, but I noticed right at the word go, first person on, this is interesting. So we also, during a presentation by Phil Hine, had the rarity of a British earthquake that actually occurred in the midst of the conference. I didn't even feel it, but upstairs in the council chamber of the town hall, which is where the conference was, there was a tangible shaking of the walls and so on. It was pretty full on, and obviously everybody's joking about the fact that somehow or another we've set off an earthquake. But on the Sunday, Dave Lee of Chaos Magic fame was doing a presentation on Austin Osman's Spare and the death posture, which was connected with breathing. And I didn't really appreciate just what was going to be set up there, because it turned out that Dave was going to take us all through a kind of breathwork session. And he's got a background in rebirthing and holotropic breathwork of Stanislav Grof. Now, you having read through Atagatis, and it's in Avalonian as well, there's a whole account of the rebirthing session that I did on my 33rd birthday. And I've included it in Atagatis because the fit of the screaming abdabs that I went through, the energy that was unleashed, was symmetrical with another occasion further on in the narrative when I took Osho Sannyas as an energy initiation in Glastonbury, and likewise ended up hyperventilating and screaming my brains out. And I think I was nicely primed by the rebirthing. Now, I'd been kind of feeling that I needed something that really put me through the Stargate and raised my emotional tone for this weekend. And although it was a great weekend, nothing had quite got there for me yet. And then there we are, quite unexpectedly, I'm essentially being set up for a rebirthing session. And I thought, well, hell's tooth, man, just go for it. Never mind what the hell's going on here. Just let yourself go. This has been set up on a plate for you. And within 10 minutes of this breathing, I've just sort of leapt up off my seat and ran on my own to a space at the back of the hall and just started really going into one halfway between an Osho Kundalini shaking meditation and a rebirthing full on. I'm making quite a bit of noise. I'm shaking, I'm laughing, I'm howling. And I've majorly gone in one. And I've connected up, essentially, with exactly the quality of energy that took me through this whole Atagatis saga. And someone that I was sitting with as the story concludes with me coming into a space of unity with a very strange Gnostic, mythic aspect of my total identity. And someone that I was sitting with saw some enormous great figure emerge out of me. My head started elongating and there was some great disc on my forehead and whatnot. All very mysterious, but it was basically like the actual narrative, the actual magical form and energy that is in that book was completely and utterly activated in the course of the weekend. And after that, I settled down for an afternoon in which Michael Staley gave an hour-and-a-half presentation on Kenneth Grant, the Typhonian trilogies. So you can't say fairer than that. And I've spoken before on a few occasions and written about what I call the inner plane dynamic of these occult conferences. How I first came to this back in the days of the Psychic Questing and the Fellowship of Isis conferences in London in the late 80s and early 90s. And I think what they're getting together in Glasgow for the occult conferences now is fulfilling that function, because it's not just me. I could say it feels like the whole thing was set up for my benefit, but there are other people having remarkable experiences. A friend of mine who came over from Sweden. She's British, but she lives in Sweden, so she's totally fluent in Swedish. The way the Gnostic Mass worked out, there were some problems. The team that was supposed to do it weren't able to, but there were some people in the OTO from Sweden, and we had the surreal scenario whereby the Gnostic Mass was performed, but it was performed primarily in Swedish. Now, I couldn't obviously understand it, but this lady from Sweden, it was kind of like it was almost put on for a benefit. There was a whole bunch of people could tell you stories like that, and at this point, I put in a plug basically for a Occult Conference 2019. They've just set up the details, or at least they've booked it for February 2019. They're taking early bird bookings, and I think Seth would be happy if you bunged a link to that into your notes. The whole thing is really powered up now.
Yeah, I was talking to Seth last night, and I was teasing him about saying, no, I'm not going to mention it, and I'm going to forbid Paul from mentioning it.
Yeah. So that's basically the wave that this thing manifested on. So there's every indication that the level of psychoactive power of it is startling, and that I'm entirely justified in feeling that a story that in some respects is 25 years old is in fact the reason to tell it is the fact that everything that's interesting in it is more alive now than it ever has been.
Well, it's like landing on a nickel from several miles out. I mean, before we hit the record button, I think you've kind of mastered non-linear memoir as ritual magic. Because I think I've read all your books. I've definitely read most of them. I'm sure I've read them all. Anyway, it's interesting that because I want to talk about cycle models and personal timing symmetries in a second, but having read your previous stuff and getting additional components of a story that fits in another cycle and they sort of nest, and this one itself has the sort of calendrical and numerical and visual motifs that open and shut it. And I've pulled out a quote from the book that you when you're talking about this kind of stuff, right? And we'll talk about the Star of Ishtar in a minute. But when you're talking about your own kind of calendrical method, you say it reveals what are at least mysterious laws of the development of the psyche that are at work to a greater or lesser extent in pretty much everybody. Potent anniversaries, 6-month reverberations, striking symmetries are there, but people lack the resources and the mindset to be aware of them and make use of them. To begin with, one must intuit that such things may exist and be worth looking for. And why I'm always so happy when it's a Paul Weston show or a Paul Weston book is I don't think anybody does this quite like you. So, What are these personal symmetries, and how do people start noticing them and taking them seriously? I mean, you've got so many examples that you could pull from your own life, but I want to kind of widen this out into essentially building one's own, or uncovering maybe is a better word, one's own kind of magical calendar.
Well, I hinted a little bit when I was talking about James Joyce about how all this kind of thing started for me. I've just kept, to begin with, on the most fundamental, simple level, really straightforward one-line diaries on sheets of A4 paper, one line per day, in which I put down the absolute basic of what I might have done that day. Now, if I'd done a bit of yoga, I just put the letter Y. If I started reading a particular book, I'd just say start, whatever the title of the book is. If I watched a movie, I'd just put the title of that movie. If I was, say, went out to Georgian Pilgrim for a chat with somebody, I'd just put G and P and maybe the initials of whoever it was I'd met there. It doesn't take much to do that. It really is not some great tremendous effort of will to just put that amount down at the end of the day or first thing the next morning. Now, I've been doing that since, the late 70s. And after a while, you've got a tremendous amount of data. Now, I really think it helps to just have a sense of each year as something as a distinct entity, as having a particular flavour, a particular mystery. There are years, for example, you discover particular strange cycles and rhythms and so forth. I would also, on separate sheets of paper, from the information, I'd just keep a list of what books I'd read, what films I'd watched, and you find, 1 year maybe you read an inordinate amount of books, and another year you hardly seem to read any. 1 year you just see 180 movies, and then in another year you just watch 30, and it's like, well, what's all that about? You've got to have about 10 years worth of information to really start to see these things. But mysterious stuff, I discovered through just flicking back in these records that there was a fortnight in February where I think 5 years on the trot I had read a 1,000-page book. 1 year it was Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales, 1 year it was The Mists of Avalon, 1 year it's John Cooper Poesis, Glastonbury Romance, I can't remember. 1 year was even Battlefield Earth by all. Another bit was like, what's going on there? Because that's the only time in the whole year I read a book that long. What the hell is it about the rhythm of the year whereby it's in the exact same fortnight, like 5 years on the trot? Because I wasn't doing it deliberately. I spotted it, about over 5 years later after I'd stopped doing it. I still don't really understand that. I still haven't got an answer for it, but it's there. These little things are enticing. I think that's the important thing. They draw you in. So having got all that information, my fun and games, which I talk about in the book and I talked about in Avalonian Eon, is to kind of play games with it and to see what happens if you start playing games with it. For example, if you feel like it'd be nice to read a particular book again and you suddenly think, well, didn't I read that book round about this time back in, 5 years ago or whatever? And oh yeah, it was actually next week. I started reading that book on the equivalent of next week. So that's what I'll do. I'll wait and I'll see if I can read it over exactly the same period of time. And again with movies. And what I found was when I did that it started to actually stir up things that you could check because of the information had absolutely exact symmetry. So the example, it's a real good example when I first started playing this game in 1991, was that I was very conscious that 10 years previously it had been a big event in my life. I'd been busted at the Stonehenge Festival for drugs. I had to appear in court in Salisbury. It was possible I could get a short prison sentence. I was obviously really freaked out. I didn't. I got fined £250, but I was aware of that. I was coming up to 10 years on from that. But I also, I did an absurd amount of book anniversary reverberations. There were books like Colin Wilson's book about Gurdjieff, The War Against Sleep. You can read it in 2 hours. I'd read it on the 15th of August 1982. So I read it on the 15th of August 1981. But there was another book about Gurdjieff, something about Thomas de Hartmann, Our Life of Mr Gurdjieff by Thomas Nolke de Hartmann. That's a real short book. I'd read that on the 15th of August in 1987, so I read that on the 15th of August 1991 as well, and I'd been reading the Bhagavad Gita in 1981 when I went to court, so I had a quick look at the Bhagavad Gita, and I thought, well, at least, whatever's going on in my life, it's not like that anymore. I haven't been busted, I haven't got to go to court. And yet a letter came through the letterbox, and it, I could see it was official, and it had come from the local council. And I've been a naughty boy and not paid my council tax, and I was basically being summoned to appear in court for £250, which was the exact same amount that I'd been fined 10 years ago to the day. Now, that sort of thing, obviously, it was a drag, but it was also exhilarating.
Yeah.
It was just fucking mysterious. I mean, obviously, the cause and effect was there. I'd been a silly boy. I'd ignored all the council tax payments because I'd rather buy books and go on weekends to Glastonbury. But it came up like that, and what it showed was cycles where what is there in the past still has meaning. And he's still there to tell you something. And at the same time, a lot of things like that were going on.
Is that a satisfactory explanation? Like, this is kind of where I wanted this to go. Like, why does it work? You can get maybe up to half of physicists today to say that time is a measurement error anyway. Like, it might not actually exist. And if you look at some of the cycle models around the world, a previous guest, Jesse Hathaway Diaz, knows a lot about Aztec and Nahuatl calendars. And they don't have their kind of cycle model isn't as damaged as ours is. So every Wednesday is the same Wednesday, and every whatever it is, day 19 is the same day 19. And I just, like, it might be right, Paul. It might actually be right. Do you know what I mean?
Well, when I come to how all of this stuff gelled together in my ultimate personal revelation, if you like, this Star of Ishtar business, I recognise that the format that is coming out in is our flawed calendar system. I'm obviously an Avalonian Eon, and to a certain extent, this much about Jose Arguelles, his presentation of the Mayan calendar system made me very aware of the fact that our calendar is not entirely natural, that when it comes to the wheel of the year, there's this distinction between the solar and the astrological belt aims and so on, that it doesn't all completely hang together, and yet one way or another some part of my brain, some part of my consciousness simply used the consensus grid in order to come to an emotional apprehension of the existence of another part of myself that was above, beyond and prior to all this, and seemed to have a profound understanding of it and was using it as a tool to reveal itself. A part of me that, we can call it the higher self, the daemon, whatever terminology you want to use. And I think ultimately I do have a very profound sense that we're living all our lives simultaneously. We have the sense of past lives and whatnot. I think that on another level of reality, it's all a unity. All of our past and future and present lives, we're a multi-dimensional, multifaceted crystal, and the whole lot is happening simultaneously. And it's at least a very useful magical spiritual fiction to somehow feel on an emotional level that might be true, because when you do that, you open up the possibility of a whole bunch of things happening and coming into your realm of understanding that simply wouldn't do if you held to a strict limited 3D sense of how the world hangs together and what you are. That you are simply the meat body that comes into manifestation and ages and disappears.
It's interesting you mention the individual component, because here's one of the kind of more interesting revelations in I guess, practical or operative magic in the last 15 years, particularly when it comes to grimoire work. If you're not getting the timing right, you've made shit. Like that's probably a big chunk of the reason why it doesn't work. And in fact, Dr. Skinner thinks it was that potent that it was probably scrambled in very, very early versions of the Key of Solomon, in the same way the spirit lists were scrambled sort of 900 years later. And the weird part about that is, like, if time doesn't work, why is timing so important? And I think it is this sort of simultaneity. The error is in our model of how it works. And the reason I'm kind of leading the discussion in that way. So people dismiss the timing model in grimoires because it sounds silly that there is an angel and a demon guarding each particular hour that you have to name and you have to line them up. And you go, well, that's dumb, isn't it? Like, this calendar is wrong and we don't do that. We use sidereal time and send spaceships to Mars and all this now. But that isn't both people are wrong in that instance. So there is something about aligning with that sameness of the hour, or that symmetry, as you call it, that seems to be an essential component of it. And I think, I read all of your books, and in particular this one, because I think it's the best example of that nested performative, biographical, experiential cycle nested inside each other, so that it can't be sufficiently unpicked. And I really do think it is it's our macro explanations of time that get in the way of it. And that I want people to kind of sit with, because in a weird way, this is easy to do. Like you just have to notice, and you have to look at as you've done, different times you've done things like read books or encountered other people or had significant family events, and look at where they hang together through time. Well, time, I'm using speech marks, which no one can see because, of course, this is audio. And I don't know, I want more people to do this, Paul. So,
well, I do, which is why I've made a point of communicating it as almost the centre of gravity of the whole work, because you put in the work. For a couple of years, I was absolutely obsessive about this whole thing about reading books on the same days and watching movies on the same days and so on. In the end, it just started to do itself. The amount of effort that I was having to put into it just fell away. I mean, I keep the diaries, I keep looking at it, but in writing a gigantic psychoactive corpus, like this work, I simply found that in terms of the tales I was telling you about the last few weeks of the final manifestation of it, that I had created a magical vehicle that was functional now, and remain functional. And as long as I engage with the broader process, all of these weird symmetrical things, they are out of my conscious control now, and they are, every single time these things happen, there is an emotional tone that goes with it that is increasingly satisfying, because you are brought to this feeling, this sense that there is a higher level of identity that is at work, that in terms of who you think you really are and what your life is, that there is some extraordinary facet of yourself that's fundamental, that is in many respects your centre of gravity, that is right outside of the normal coordinates. And that expansiveness, is not something that's just an afterglow, an emotional high from some frenzied ritual. It's something that just abides. And obviously, as the years go by and more of these things happen, and they literally just become normal, it becomes a natural rhythm of your life. Just into a very satisfyingly expanded sense of your own identity. That is both proved consistently, by these manifestations.
See, that's why it's still, I don't know if it's quite out of your hands. I think you're good enough at it. It's more like a dance or a spa, because and this is kind of where I'm driving at, because in Pieces of 8, there's a chapter called Getting Their Attention, and then the back of it is all about building your own calendar. And I don't mean it in a kind of scrapbooking hobby way. I mean what you've kind of talked about in this book. It's those symmetries and match and find that cycle language, because you jumped on it. So you jumped on, the universe did, let's say, 2/3 of it, but you saw the occult conference coming up and you saw the dates for it and you said, okay, I'm going to get it done for that. So this is where it's a dance. Like, you're moving with the rhythm of it and you get a net positive effect.
If I did manage to do this thing 25 years on, there was no way that there wasn't going to be a whole bunch of stuff that would somehow be thrown up by that, and that would all be a surprise to me, but would make complete sense as it happened, and that there would be things that, seem to be completely out of my conscious control, or even have nothing to do with me and are part of some bigger picture. But the way the various things happened in the conference, particularly the Dave Lee mini rebirthing session, it was spectacular. All normal senses of cause and effect just are completely broken down and outshined in events like that.
Yeah. Well, you've turned synchromysticism into your own form of practical enchantment, and I think it's fascinating to watch. But
and I think, the thing that's most important is I think this stuff is one way or another there for everybody, and you can find your way to it through the basic data of your own life.
Absolutely. That's why I want people to do their own calendars, because I don't think we were just saying humans have time wrong. I think you are the center of it. Whoever you are listening to this, there's some sort of hermetic phenomenological cycle function to the universe, which means you can't just email Paul and ask for a list of auspicious dates and use that as your calendar.
Got your own auspicious dates, and as Crowley says, every man, every woman is a star. We're all unique in our own orbit, and it's finding out what that orbit is. And you've already got the data. In your own life will actually reveal it to you if you are able to look at it in the right way, the appropriate way for you.
And there's an art. It the next level. There is an art. Yeah. So August 15 for you, Paul, that's Feast of the Assumption, right?
Well, yeah, that keeps coming back. It was a big thing in the manifestation of Ishtar in the story, and it had been in 1981 as well.
Well, so you read a Bob Wilson book on the Feast of the Assumption, and he was obsessed with the 20th century doctrine of bodily assumption, but also Gurdjieff is what put Whitley Strieber into space, if we can describe it that way. So you're reading all this stuff on the Feast of the Assumption, which is that kind of verticality of human into stars. And you didn't know this at the time. And this is kind of that next level. When you find your important dates, you start to match it to other cycles in the world. And that's where you feel the kind of language of it.
And this was, the narrative, we found ourselves pointed towards a date, which was supposedly a feast of the ancient Phoenician goddess Atargatis, but also the Tibetan New Year and New Moon. There are a whole bunch of things in this system, the Star of Ishtar, that me and my friend Dana had come together and in an intensive session, and just, this conversation after a few very powerful spliffs, all this stuff about time and dates and anniversaries and synchronicities and how the wheel of the year hangs together. The great thing about it was that you can road test it. It was something that you could experiment with, and if it was a goer, it was going to show itself very clearly, and it would soon also show whether it was a dud or not, because you just wouldn't be getting any results from it.
Exactly.
But when you're, somehow by that means, that mode of art, magic, creativity, whatever the hell it is, playing games with reality, you are led to a particular date, and you end up somewhere that you wouldn't normally have been, and some great epic unfolds. You know that is the way for you to follow, that you have found, you've connected up to the star that you really are.
Well, speaking of stars, that's a lovely sentiment. The premium members are doing a course on the role of saints in European magical tradition at the moment. And there is a fantastic story about a church in Cumbria that we were talking about before we hit record in the book that I wonder if you could maybe describe for the listeners.
Right, okay. So we're talking about Bega's Church here. One of, or perhaps the truly greatest of all the psychic quests from the golden age of psychic questing in the late 80s and early 90s was involving St Bega and the Triple Ring of Bega, set off by Alex Langstone. And we all ended up in November 1990 out in the middle of nowhere, as it were, in the Lake District, at this church that's set right apart, and it's a classic story of one of these Irish saints who come over from Ireland, and there are these kind of archetypal stories told. It's a woman, and she's due to be married. She doesn't want to be married, and runs away to become a nun, and comes over the Irish Sea and lands this place called St Bees Head, and a local ruler. She asked for some land, to build a church or whatever, and a local ruler mockingly says, and this is in high summer, you can have the amount of land that snow covers tomorrow morning. And there is this miraculous snow shower that covers a chunk of land that she ends up with. But the mystery in all this is that we discover that effectively St Bees Head is a potential omphalos of the whole of Great Britain. If you stick that as a centre point and draw a big circle, it goes, all the way around the north of Scotland and most, almost every last bit of Ireland. And we ended up there. And the whole story that unfolded there, it was how I became habituated to just letting go of consensus reality. I've told the story in Attagardis about how I'd done a full day's work in where I worked in Southend in the VAT HQ, and then we'd all met up, the questing group, in the early evening, and then driven all the way from Essex up to Cumbria, which is quite a haul actually. And part of the itinerary of sites was the Stone Circle at Long Meg, and it's November. I'm literally sleeping outside in a German army sleeping bag with an aluminium foil blanket wrapped round me. I've got, a winter coat hat and gloves on, and I'm lying there and I'm looking up at the stars, and it's like nearly midnight, and there's this stone circle thousands of years old that you can just about see looming out of the darkness. And it's like, I woke up that morning in Southend. I'd done a day's work in an office, and there I was. And the minute we woke up the next morning, we just got out of our sleeping bags and just walked over and started this meditation visualization. And everything went bonkers from that point on. We were in that thing for like 4 days and 4 nights, wandering about the landscape, doing stuff 24/7. And in the end, we all end up back. The ridiculous stuff happened. We were on some farmer's land. Maybe we'd made a bit of a mistake in terms of how we treated the whole thing, but this guy and his cronies turn up waving a shotgun at us, and we've got to get off his land, and we're escorted out of town, and we think we've buggered it all right up. But the great psychic Debbie saw this image of his church and said, we've got to go back there now. And that was another hour on where we were. We'd gone miles away by then. And we ended up back there on this now legendary Saturday night in November. And one of the things about the landscape geometry, we were talking about a triple ring of Bega. The outside of this thing went round the whole of Great Britain, and then there was a smaller circle, that took in the likes of Long Meg, Stone Circle, and places that we've been to. And we'd been working on this thing for months, but we were there that night, and we went into the church. It was unlocked. I don't think they do that these days. This was back in 1990, and the place was absolutely full of presences. We were just in there by torchlight, and all of a sudden Deb gets this kind of feeling that something's going on. She's almost channeling Bega, and we got to go outside. We all dash outside. Now I didn't have the psychic vision to see this, but a number of people all saw the same thing. There's like some little mini firework display up in the sky above us, and then there's a sound of something tinkling, like something small and metallic as it's stone. And Deb says something's landed, something's here, and we find there's a standing old cross in the churchyard, and on one of the ridges of it we find it. Basically, this little triple ring. It's in 3 different sort of shades of gold. It's this. Apparently, the reality of it is that it's a form of wedding ring in Russia. But whatever the fuck, we called it the miracle. We were just all over the show, and the whole thing. Alex has gone into a lot of detail on this in his book Spirit Chaser. you're in a landscape that's full of history. It's full of poetry. It's it's the kind of place that Wordsworth has been around, and all the rest of it. There's stories of Irish saints, Celtic church vintage, and all the rest of it. And the levels of it. Once we'd done this, I then discovered there was a chap called James Rendell Harris from the 1920s who'd written these really strange books. And he said that Bega was an Egyptian star presided over by Isis. And when I drew Alex's attention to this set off another level of the game. And he went back to Bega's church, working with a whole bunch of material that Rendell Harris had come up with in the 1920s, involving Ursa Major and Bega as Vega, and stuff involving circumpolar stars and a point in the landscape when you go north where they'll set below the horizon. It turns out most of all this stuff from an astronomical point of view doesn't really work, but in terms of where it plugged people's heads in and the magic and the associations, we got immense results out of it. And in the end, Alex got an apported amethyst crystal in the church there in 1992, and it all follows through into a strange scenario that we did at Avebury at the end of 1992 with the so-called Avebury Serpent. I won't say too much about it. I want to leave a few teasers.
Oh no, absolutely. I wanted to draw people's attention to the Bega story because it's a really good example. So even if the kind of the 1920s astrotheological theory doesn't hold, it's nevertheless it does appear that Bega is a gloss for some form of stars. Like, it does sound like Vega, right? So
it works. I mean, this is, I think, very interesting for the present day, and like for those of us that have seen certain sorts of ideas, come through in the 60s and in the 70s. Each decade, this thing kind of reformats itself. Where we're at now with our astronausis or whatever, obviously seems like, it's the epitome of our knowledge, and we're getting somewhere. I don't doubt that a certain amount of it essentially, we'll say, is true in inverted commas, but you can bet your bottom dollar it's going to mutate, and in another 20 years. But what it is, it's a vehicle. It's a vehicle for our heads to get into a certain way of thinking and feeling about stuff and become open to a whole bunch of ingress from who knows where of all manner of strange ideas and associations. People plug into this. Some people, seek to consciously become the vehicles of it, and other people simply to understand it, and it inspires art, and it inspires occultists, and it inspires conspiratorially minded people. And I think, everything that's, coming to the boil in the States and that Chris is documenting so well is kind of part of that. I mean, yes, it's true, but on the other hand, it will kind of, bits of it will just dissolve like fairy gold and then reformulate in another 10 years, and it will seem as if whatever formulation it is has always been the case.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it is very mysterious, and it is, it's magical, and it's ultimate, just like in the 60s. In the 50s and the 60s, I think the UFO phenomenon was a carrier wave. Jacques Vallée would say something along these lines. It's like in Britain, the whole Earth mystery scene, people going out to ancient sites, thinking about ley lines, having all-night vigils at places and all the rest of it, was undoubtedly revitalised by an early association of ufology with this. And the ufological association dissolved, but what you were left with was people then delving ever more greatly into the genuine history and folklore and so on of the particular sites. And tremendous richness came out of this. And some elusive mercurial something had breezed through and somehow enabled that to happen, helped that to happen, and then gone somewhere else. That's not to say none of that, no ufological associations remain in the Earth mysteries, but there was a really strong period for that. And I think you'd probably find that right across the board with how things are now. When you've got that perspective of looking back decade by decade at how this kind of thing does work, it enables you to not get quite so fixed in your idea that you totally understand something, and this is how it is. This is how it's working at the moment. Boogie with it, see how far you can get with it. It does seem to be deepening in its complexity, but Hell's Teeth, it's always seemed like it's deepening in its complexity, and you're right on. How many times have we heard that disclosure is imminent? It's like, wow, I think I remember first hearing about that when Spielberg was making Close Encounters, and it was whatever decades anniversary of Roswell, blah blah blah, and it's that sense of imminence is what's important for actually making people open to a whole bunch of possibilities. And there is some intelligence, if you like, that is very adept at playing that game with our consciousness, and you can't second guess it, but it is obviously, one of the best games there is to try and figure it out. And when you're in the grip of it, it's an exhilaration. You have to give over to it. But I'm also mindful of all the, down through the ages, the contactee cults and all the rest of it. John Keel will tell you all about this. They're given real data, they're given real information, they're strung along, and then the rug's just pulled out from under their feet, and then it just moves on to somewhere else. So you've always got to be wary of that.
Whatever's behind the one-way mirror, Dr. Kreipel's one-way mirror, sets the board, and we just play the game, and they do pull it and that's, I think you're right. I think wherever the sort of astrotheology is now feels like it's closer, but it is still, it's the current redescription of whatever it is on the other side of the one-way mirror. And I feel like Bega was such a good example of that for me, because as far as I could tell reading the book, on your first encounter, you were unaware that she probably never historically existed, and it appears to be, an astro myth embedded in the early Christian church in Britain. But nevertheless, the experience was one of going outside and seeing lights in the sky and getting an object, and then only subsequently does it. Do other people look at the astrotheological line, and that has that ring of authentic contact to it, this is the language it's speaking now, and I think we should try and learn the bits of it we can.
Well, yeah, the great thing about all that was that it brought us into connection with a beautiful landscape that's just so full of history and mythology, and that whole strata, the stories of the saints of the Celtic Church and so on, is absolutely stonkingly beautiful. I mean, Alex,
stunning.
Come feel that, there probably was a Bega, and that she opened up to a certain amount of wisdom that was hung over from the Druids and whatever, and the Star Law comes in the back of that. But the contact, if you like, with now, it is such that, you're going to get more out of her than any historical individual would ever have specifically known. But she serves as the vehicle for, that because it's the form of a saint, that there is going to be something benevolent about following that contact in a way that maybe other contacts might be more problematical. These saintly dudes are way showers and gateways to realms of beauty and wisdom.
Speaking my language, Paul. Absolutely. All right, so I know it's early morning there, and you have to get on with your day, which is a pity because
I'm all right for now. If you've got,
good. All right. So, tell us about the Three Figures visitation.
Well, yeah, this is in terms of one of the great themes I think in everybody's life is there some mysterious destiny working through? Are you potentially the vehicle for forces that you've barely even, got the slightest sense of existing? Well, when I was in tumultuous, we'll call it a relationship, it didn't really conform to any normal sense of that term, with this lady called Dana, who's very, very psychic. She used to see all kinds of visionary stuff, and some of it was concerning me. And there was one, she used to talk about, these guys would literally turn up in the bedroom after we turned the lights off. Very, very tall. She sometimes said they were almost 18 feet tall, but just very tall, robed, hooded figures. You couldn't see their faces. You couldn't work out what gender they were, but she always said they were male. And she said they were something to do with specifically me. And they came, that old chestnut from Sirius. They used to turn up a lot, and there was just something about this thing of the three men. It was interesting. And one day, she saw a vision that she said was like my christening or something like that. I was in a church, and she knew what my parents looked like. She sent a photo of them, in my living room, but they looked, that bit younger. And I'm there as a baby, and it's some sort of christening. But she can also see, at the same time, superimposed on this scene, something infinitely more mysterious, which is me as an adult on some kind of throne. And here are these guys, again, these three robed figures. This time they've got eye in the triangle designs on their hoods. So this puts it, very much in Crowley territory. And they're standing around me, and one of them's making these gesticulations above my head. And it's like it's another kind of Christian ceremony, if you like, of a very different nature. And both of these things are scenarios which are indicative of my landing coordinates, if you like, in this incarnation. And I thought, well, okay, that's all very striking, but like, what the hell is there that I can anchor that to reality with? It was strange that later that day, because this was like in the early hours of the morning, and then I went to work that day, and I bumped into my father in Southend, and he was like in his 70s then, and he hardly ever came to Southend, let alone on his own. And I asked him, I said, did I ever? I didn't even know whether I'd got christened or not. And I talked to my mother that night, and I'd had a dedication ceremony months after I'd been born, which was not quite the exact date. It was about a week away. I thought, well, yeah, okay, that's intriguing, but we'll see where we get to with that. Well, it's a lot later in the year, further into the story. It's Christmas. It's coming up to Christmas time. And I'm really now in the depths of the weirdness. It's fully broken out. I've taken Osho Sannyas, I've taken Reiki 1, I've got this Star of Ishtar thing about to erupt. We're right in the middle of all of this. Some strange things have happened. I've been on my James Joyce Nighttown episode, and I've gone round to see my parents, and my father's really ill. He's got a kind of pneumonia type situation because his lungs were weak, because he's got shrapnel in his lungs as a result of what happened to him in the Second World War. And he was daft enough to not smoke. It always really knocked him scatty. But this time he was completely delirious, and he'd been having visions, hallucinating in the bedroom that he was standing on the deck of some 19th century clipper ship with somebody. And this is sort of stuff that just never, ever, ever happened, ever. He was Mr. Normal. He'd got a brick wall in his head to prevent any kind of weirdness getting in. And as a result of this story that he was telling, my mother suddenly comes up with this story of how in 1946, after the war, when she was living on her own in London, before she met my father, it was about 3 years before she met my father, she woke up. Well, she didn't wake. She had gone to bed, and she was sort of trying to get to sleep, but something woke her up, and she opened her eyes, and at the end of the bed were these three really tall, robed, hooded figures. And it scared the shit out of her, and she thought that it was really evil, and they just kind of dissolved away. Now, I was 33 by then. I had never heard this story before. It's possible that if my father hadn't been telling this story about this weird visionary thing that he'd experienced in the bedroom, I may never have heard it. But it's been brought to my attention after this extraordinary vision of Dana, and quite clearly, whatever was going on there, it was meant to make me feel that it was for real, and that somehow or another there were these beings or forces or whatever the hell you want to call them, however you want to characterise them, that existed outside space-time and were on my case and have been checking my mother out. If you think of oh right, we'll just accept the myth of linear time, they've been checking my mother out before she even met my father. And that was infinitely flipping mysterious, especially being as what unfolds out of that, and what becomes one of the major themes ultimately in the story is past lives. Past lives run all the way through this, and the fact that I don't fully accept the standard version of what they represent, but there's no question that giving over to the mythos activates a whole area of your consciousness that is otherwise unavailable. And the revelation of this mysterious factor at play, not just in my head, but somehow in my parents as well, the emotional intensity of that enabled me to be receptive to what was about to happen, which was the magical core of the story. And so that's one side of the family. I'm not going to tell, I've alluded to giving all the details, but in the end I discovered that there's some very mysterious stuff that happened to my father out in India.
That was amazing. Yeah, people can get that in the book. Did you ever ask your mother if she asked her mother about tall robed figures at the end of the bed? Because I wonder if it's you specific or I wonder if it's family specific.
And this is a bit mysterious because my mother's father was in the Plymouth Brethren. And was a lay preacher, just like Crowley's father. Now, I don't make too much out of that. I could have made something out of that in previous books, but there is that thing. They were really flipping strict. My mother went to a kiddies party where there was a bit of music and she had a bit of jig about, and my grandfather flipping whipped the eye off her with a leather belt for that. They're not the kind of family that's going to talk about shit like that.
Gotcha.
It is, there it is anyway, so it is pretty damn strange. I wouldn't like to say, I've never had anything more of that since that period of time. I mean, I think some people would go a bundle on it and they'd try and invoke those entities and they'd be thinking about them all the time and what's going on. There was a period of time where, they're about, because I'm with somebody that can see them quite a lot, and I accepted it as part of the magical drama, part of the magical fiction, if you like, because magical fiction is another big theme in the book, and I treated all of this as like, I'm going to believe it, but I'm not going to get absolutely flipping dogmatic and tablet of stone about it, because people, especially occultists, can get really flipping inflated about this kind of shit, and you have to beware. But it was all part of a very mysterious configuration, which I've tried to express in the book.
Yeah, you're right. Not everything that exists needs to be summoned. I mean, you talk about, speaking of magical fiction, you talk about Castaneda and Strieber towards the beginning, and they have quite good models for us being embedded in a wider spirit world. You don't know what these things are doing. They're just because sharks exist doesn't mean you have to catch them. Just let it go.
Well, Strieber and Castaneda, are very, very important. I've expressed things in the book that show how they alerted me to a particular feeling of mystery about my own life. And I've said this now alone in Eon, and I've brought in Castaneda to the same theme here, because what always stimulated me about the communion story wasn't the kind of stuff that most people really focused on. My thing was that what happens with Strieber is that once he becomes aware of this chink in everyday consciousness where something very mysterious has happened and he begins to remember it, that thing that he starts to remember just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and more extensive. And in the end, he realises that it is in fact more important and more fundamental to his life and his sense of who he is and what his life is all about than the life that he thought he was leading. The person that he thought he was is in fact, a very limited fiction, that there is a secret life that has in effect been living him, that his 3D identity, is just a very limited part of some vast and greater mystery. And as he begins to uncover it, it's like his centre of gravity shifts. And the I that is living him is something far bigger and far more mysterious. And there are stories in Castaneda, and The Eagle's Gift is the book that I zero in on in Atagatis, because he uncovers a set of memories, and he does this in association with a group of sorcerers that they'd all lived together in a home in a particular town, and had associations with people who taught them various magical things. The mysterious dreaming with a capital D. All of this stuff they'd all forgotten about. It all happened you could work out dates and places for it. It had been going on for years, and yet all of them had completely forgotten it had ever even happened. And it's some life that's going on in another part of the brain simultaneously, and gradually they uncover it, and it comes forth, and they're not the same. And I just had this feeling way back when I first read Strieber in 1987 that there was some part of me that was on another level of the game, that there was some mysterious thing playing out that I had not fully apprehended, and that I somehow would do. And once I got that sense, it wasn't that long before the first, indication that was the case had happened, when I realised that me and Andy Collins had both been in Glastonbury at the same time in 1985, when he was completing his epic Glastonbury Zodiac quest, which I would ultimately connect with on such a profound level. I was at the Glastonbury Festival, the first great mud bath in 1985, and I'd been reading stuff about Glastonbury and the Zodiac and everything for months and months and months. And I'd gone up in a helicopter. They'd been offering a helicopter ride for, $5 or whatever at the festival. And me and the people I was with went up, and I was up in this helicopter very briefly, and I was looking, could I see the Glastonbury Zodiac? And when I spoke to Andy later, I realised that if I'd known where to look, if I'd had a pair of binoculars, I could have seen him, in his car or walking about in a field somewhere on the way to the conclusion of the great epic of his life that would download virtually everything he's done since. And my own connection to him, and the 3D side of that was that when I went into the Glastonbury Town Centre after the festival, there were a bunch of publications in Gothic Image that were the old newsletter, EarthQuest News, that he used to publish, that was full of early Psychic Quest information and all the rest of it. I'd read The Green Stone then, but I hadn't really clocked that this EarthQuest News was by somebody that was part of that. And when I read them, I could see it was published in Essex, and there were stories about places that I knew. Some part of my brain already knew that I was going to be part of all this. Yeah. And, it was 3 years later before I met him, but some other, consciousness outside space-time was already aware of the fact that me and him were going to meet, and that the whole Glastonbury work that he engaged in would prove to be the turning point of my whole life. And once I'd clocked that, again, once you realise that there is something like that at work in your life, it stirs up a quality of emotion that nothing else really does, and inevitably opens you up to receptivity to more of the same. And then truly the game is afoot.
I don't know if there's a better place to ever end the show than with that. Honestly, congratulations, Paul. It's another excellent book and a fantastic chat once again. The details for the book and the 2019, because it is 2018, Occult Conference will be in the show notes. But any other stuff you got going on, anywhere else people should look, lay it on them now.
Well, right at the moment, other than the fact that the book's available on Amazon UK and USA from my friend Chandira, and also if people are elsewhere in the world and they want to contact me, I'm easily reachable about how potentially I can post books off elsewhere, although maybe the postage might be a bit fearsome, but I'm at the moment, fully engaged in this. Actually, one little story I will tell that's a nice little after. I was going to go from this back into my old Deal Fortune Magical Britain thing.
Oh, yeah.
But I recognised that the psychic intensity of that was really, really very strong and pretty difficult to navigate. And when I came, day after the conference, I came out of my front entrance of my block of flats, and I found, this is 9:30 in the morning, I found a woman lying on the pavement, covered in blood. I mean, covered in blood. I mean, there was people with her. She had a blanket over her. She was conscious. She was quite distressed. 9:30 in the morning, I went off, did my shopping, hung out in town, come back 40 minutes later. She's still there. There's a police car now. I don't know what happened. I haven't been able to find out anything. The pavement is stained with blood. It just said to me, all right, mate, just be careful here. There's some really powerful stuff going on. And I decided to swap channels. I started writing a book about Colin Wilson a few years ago. I wanted to just do something in the way that he used to write books that were about 100 pages long as an intro to Gurdjieff or Crowley or Jung or Steiner. That I do one about him. And I decided I'm going to switch back to that. I'm going to get that one out of the way, because having that sort of stuff, Colin Wilson, it's like a breath of fresh air in the springtime, and we'll come back to all the major league karmic intensity of goddamn Nazi occultism and Glastonbury and Deal Fortune later on in the year.
I think that's a good idea.
Oh, yeah. So I roll.
Have a Wilson holiday. All right. Well, Paul, always a pleasure. And
yeah, great to talk. John, it's a bit crazy. It's 8:20 in the morning here. It's going to be an unusual day, I can tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll let you get on with it.
All right. Yay, sir. Bye for now.
There's not really much to add to a Paul Weston episode. My only observation is that the more precise you become in your magical and synchronistic timing, the firmer your conviction becomes that we have time very wrong. If you're looking for how a personal calendrical/symmetrical system might look in execution, then Paul's entire oeuvre is where you want to start, with the most detailed exploration of it in the latest book, itself an essential component of and result of said system. So that's it. Details as ever in the show notes below. Let me know what you think at runesoup.com or the RuneSoup Facebook page. Subscribe to the show, review the damn show, and find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.